Hello, YouTube. My name is Philip on Water. My real name is Philip Lebsack. Joining me again is James T. Dolemen. This is part two of our last session that we were doing on the topic of the Greek language and how it underlies the New Testament. So today we're going to be continuing on that topic.
I
Yeah,
want to
go
say
ahead.
that that's exactly why we study the Greek because we want to go back to the
Yeah.
original. We don't want the Greek language to be able to express something that we want to express, but we want
Mm,
to shift our mind to how ancient Greek would understand the New Testament. Or ancient Greek speakers would understand the New Testament. That's why we learn. That's why we study Greek in the first place. And,
mm,
and I also want to say that um, it, I think it's a wrong perception that Bible is what Jesus said is so easy that even peasants can understand. You don't need to be you don't need to be a learned person to understand the gospel. I think that's wrong. Because um, because in ancient time, whatever thing is written, they are only written for the elites. Peasants don't
mm.
read. They're not able to read. They it's good that they learn to read and write and be able to read, but
Are you
it's not
calling
widespread.
everyone peasants? How dare you in your arrogance? Is that what you're
Okay.
doing? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I'm saying that if you don't read Greek and to the in from the perspective of the Greek people, if you don't read Greek, you are a barbarian.
Well, don't you think like Tyndale though, Doleman? I mean, shouldn't we have a Bible in the hand of every plowboy
Should we though?
in their
Because
language, right?
the reason why the book was written is because, well, let me put it this way. Ancient books are not Twitter posts. They're not
Mm,
just words written down.
mm,
People write things in a very, very careful way to conceal a lot of information in there. And not every common people think this way.
mm,
Only those who are properly trained can think this way. And who are those
mm.
people? The bishops. They were trained
Right.
in years in monasteries to learn to think this way. Or in the early church,
James,
they're trained in many years under the hands of the apostles.
since we're on this topic, would can we talk about the passage in Second Peter or maybe it's in First Peter where he says that Scripture is not subject to private interpretation because
Yes.
it's really interesting. In our book, of course, we talk about this. So, but it's really interesting to me because popularly in Protestantism, people interpret that to say that that means that like the Pope or the clergy cannot have their own interpretation, but we're actually saying. But apparently, right, in our studies, we actually interpret that differently because actually what Peter's saying is that it's the opposite. It's like
Mm,
people in general cannot have their own interpretation, like you and me.
yes.
That's reserved for the bishops. So it's
Right.
like when we read that passage in Peter, we see like the complete reverse of what's popularly understood
Yeah.
about it. Would you elaborate on that?
Yes, I think that's exactly the problem back then because uh, Peter saw the beginning, the rise of the heresies started to happen in the early church, and they were quoting the Bible. They were using the scriptures, and Peter said that don't listen to those people. They are false teachers. Like the idea of false teachers is that they use scriptures, they interpret things wrongly, and they're telling Peter is saying that don't follow their teaching. Follow our teaching. Why? Because we have followed Christ. We have seen his glory on the holy mountain. We have
Mhm.
followed him for so many years. Like
And we have been ordained by him through him breathing his spirit into us and through
that's
the laying
right.
on of hands, right? So
That's right.
uh
That's right.
so Man, I think that's so important because people just don't think about the context, you know? Like
Hmm.
people take that verse and they say, see, you can't have your own private interpretation. It's your truth. I have my truth. Let's all just get along. And you can't tell me that what the bishop says is more good than me because he can't have his private interpretation. No, people, that's not the context of what Peter
Mm,
was saying. In the context, Peter was ordained and he was in the position of authority, and
yeah,
he's saying everybody else cannot have their private interpretation.
that's
But he
right.
did have the right because he's Peter. And his
Mm,
successor did have the right because he was
mm,
Peter's successor. And
yeah,
not just Peter, but the successors of all the apostles through the
that's right.
ordination who were the bishops. And those
Mm,
bishops today in Orthodoxy can trace their
yeah,
ordination back to the apostles. Again,
right.
that's something that we can make a whole video
Yeah,
about on its own,
right,
you know.
right.
But the point, I think that's a really important thing to talk about because
Mm,
many people do not have the right understanding of that passage. You know, it's
right,
like the
right.
Matthew 7 thing, do not judge lest you be judged. People take one verse out of context and then they abuse it. You know, Matthew
Yes.
7 is probably the most abused, that verse is probably the most abused verse in the whole Bible, but there's so
Yes,
many. And this one from Peter is another example. So
that's right.
yeah,
That's right.
thank you for
And I,
explaining that. I think that is so
yeah,
important. Yeah, go ahead.
and I want to say that even the bishops cannot have their like private interpretation. Like they,
Yeah.
it's not saying that their interpretation is right simply by virtue of their being a bishop. That's not the
Mm.
case. Their
Yeah.
own understanding of the scripture, their preaching of the scripture must be based on the tradition of the church, which the tradition, idea of the tradition is not just a custom. That's
Yeah.
what many people think about tradition. Tradition is just a custom. It's a long generational kind of habit. That's not what tradition is. Tradition is what is handed down to us.
Mm.
So they have to follow what is handed down to us, whether it's expressed in the Christian life, prayer, fasting, almsgiving,
Mm.
all kinds of virtual
Yeah.
and practices, or expressed in um, the church councils,
Mm.
like ecumenical councils and sometimes local councils, or in the especially I would say in accordance with the lives of the saints. Like
Mm.
for example, Polycarp. Like if you
Mm.
interpret the Bible and the interpretation of your Bible, if you apply them, it makes you look nothing like how the saints live. I'm sorry, your interpretation is
Yeah.
absolutely wrong.
Yeah.
Absolutely wrong. That's
Yeah.
just
The
that's
the the
just
the correct, in other words, the correct interpretation of the scriptures is the lives of the saints, right?
right. Yeah.
And so yeah, so anyways, to summarize what you said though,
Mm,
yeah, the bishops they have to follow the tradition on the one hand. On the other hand, though, they have the ordination and they have the Spirit of God in them
mm.
through the ordination, and so they can interpret things in certain contexts, whereas we do
Right.
not have that
Right.
level of ability to do
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
properly,
Yeah.
right?
And also that
So
tradition is the whole point of the tradition is that's the original. That's where they go back to. That's the original.
yeah,
That's the whole idea. And that's again back to the Greek. That's why we
yeah,
learn Greek. That's why we need to learn Greek. We want people to study Greek, and that's why we present our study of Greek and let people see the conclusion. And we are not making up those conclusions. Everything we say here, you can find these things in other Orthodox priests, their preachings, their writings. You can find we actually quote a lot of like we quote church fathers, we quote
mm,
you can find in those in
mm,
these materials in those sources. So
yeah, yeah, yeah. And I just want to add to that. Read the church fathers, you know, like read Saint Justin Martyr's works. You don't have to read it in Greek. You can read it in English too, okay? Read Saint Justin Martyr's work. Read Irenaeus's Against Heresies. Read Saint John of Damascus's work. Like if you read these ancient writers, you know, minimally, even if you're not, even if you don't want to subscribe to Orthodoxy, or you have a low view of the church fathers, or even if you're not a Christian, okay, minimally, these are ancient writers, okay? They understood the culture and language in their times. different than we do. When I say different, I mean that in a better sense. Okay, they understood it better than we do. Okay, minimally, you can respect and appreciate them for that, and oftentimes they will comment on language problems. Like for example, Irenaeus, he says that when Paul was writing, he assumed that people was going to read his text out loud and read it at a fluent pace. Well, that helps you when interpreting Paul because that means that you can't just take one verse of Paul out of context. You have to read it all together. You have to look at the bigger picture. And so, and in Protestantism, that's what, oftentimes people sometimes like to do is like to take one verse or a couple verses and say, here it is, and make, whole systematic
Right.
theologies out of it and stuff. Anyways, the point is that, yeah, if you study all these things we refer to in the book, The Orthodox Understanding, we refer to a lot of stuff. Okay. If you study all these on your own, you can come to the same conclusions. We've just taken the time to put it all together, make it more simple, connect the dots and this type of thing. But yeah, back to the Greek. So Dolemen, I wanted to talk with you specifically. I wanted to comment more specifically about the last part of our reading from the Greek section of our book. Um, the part on Greek lost to the West, okay, where I read that the English philosopher Roger Bacon and then the other Italian scholar and poet Petrarch around the 13th to 14th century saying that there's only like a handful of scholars in the West who knew Greek grammar. Doleman, can you comment on that? What are some other examples or other ways we know that Greek was becoming lost in the West? Do you have some more to add to that? And how is that significant and affecting how the West came to interpret the Bible and versus how the East has always interpreted it? Can you comment on that, please?
I think what I really want to say is the consequence of losing the Greek. The most serious consequence is look at St. Augustine. He didn't know Greek, and he made it up a bunch of doctrines, and very problematic doctrines.
Can you talk
Um,
about St. Augustine a little more then? Because he's actually a saint in Orthodoxy, right? So can you
right,
explain to
right.
people? Because when I was talking in some more academic circles, whenever I was in seminary, people said, but Augustine's a saint and he teaches substitutionary atonement. Why don't you accept it? And I had to explain that, well, even though he's a saint for a different reason. He's not a saint for his theology, he's a saint for other things he did.
Mm.
And then just because he's a saint, that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to believe everything he teaches, right? So can
Mhm.
you can you explain this?
Well, St. Augustine was a saint because he's a great saint of repentance, not because
Hmm.
he's a great theologian. And actually, in Orthodoxy, there are only three people who are called theologian. St. John, the evangelist, um, who's the second one? Gregory of Nazianzus, and St. Simeon, the new theologian. These are only three people in the entire Orthodox history that are called theologians. So,
Why do so
Augustine,
many people like Augustine, do you think? Like, I feel like there's a lot of Augustine lovers, but there aren't
that's
people who
right.
are like
Right.
Cappadocian Father lovers. Like, why is that the case?
Well, the most important reason was that in the Western Christianity is Latin Christianity. That's how the East always refer to the West. The Latins, the Latins are wrong.
Hmm.
All the Latins. And Augustine wrote in Latin, and Augustine wrote only in Latin. And he had great volumes talking about all kinds of things. He wrote catechism, he wrote theological treatise, he had his confessions, and his City
Hmm.
of God was like a fundamental like framework for later Western Christianity's um, like sort of political thought. You can say
Hmm.
that. Like how do they understand the kingdom of God and kingdom of the world? Like there are two kingdoms going on. Well, in the East, we don't think it this way. We will talk about that in another time. But St. Augustine was very, very important because he had a lot of volumes and he's a saint and also like his influence was also I think enhanced by um, um, Pope Saint Gregory the Great, the Bishop of Rome. So he was sort of Augustinian. So like after the fall of the
Mm.
Western Roman Empire, like the kind of the connection between East and West, they still have connection between East and West.
Mm.
But like after like the I think I don't remember exactly when, about the time of Charlemagne in the West, they really try to like cut the tie with the East and try to get sort of autonomy, and it from that period of time, from that time on, um, like when people think about great Latin theologians, like Tertullian wasn't church father. Tertullian wasn't a saint. Although Tertullian was a great Latin writer, but he wasn't a saint. Who do you go to? Augustine was the only one. He's almost the only option. You have Saint Cassian, but Saint Cassian was more monastic. Like his work is more read in monasteries, not in the church in parishes.
Mm.
Among the I wouldn't say academics, it doesn't fit that time, but among the clergies. But Augustine was read widely among clergies compared to the monasteries. So that's how Augustine had his influence. And later theologians based their understandings upon Augustinian theology. St. Anselm, no, sorry, he's not a saint in Orthodoxy, but in Catholicism, he's a saint. Anselm based his um, a lot of ideas, especially the original sin issue. We will talk about this in the future episode. The original sin idea is a foundation for how like every like theory of atonement, every theory of salvation is based in the West. So there's
Mm.
no salvation. You don't talk about salvation apart from the Augustinian understanding of original sin, which surprisingly, Orthodox Church does not believe in the original sin in the way the
Mm.
Western does, which is really
Right,
surprising to a
yeah.
lot of people, right?
We
So,
have a whole section in our book on that, by the way.
right, right,
Yeah.
and that like the entire in the Western anthropological theology. Original seeing is the core part of it. The other core would be the image of God, Imago Dei. So Imago Dei and original sin are like two like very important part of it. So the original sin idea comes from St. Augustine. And because that has been such an important part in the Western theology, it's not possible that you talk about theology in general without talking about Augustine. And of course, you cannot talk about salvation without talking about Augustine. That's why there's so many people like whenever they talk about theology, even the reformers, the most church fathers they quote was from St. Augustine because like that's where they go back to. That's the source of Latin theology. And that's why St. Augustine was so important to the West. But he didn't know Greek. So a lot of his
Mm.
understandings kind of cut away from the Greek culture, from the Greek like
Mm.
linguistic like understanding of things like concept in general.
Mm.
So and that of course when you have Latin theological source like Augustine are so great
Did
as
you say
Augustine.
Latin theological sauce?
Yes,
Is that what you said? Sauce? Like
source.
SAUCE?
No, Source, source.
Okay.
No sauce, source.
Latin theological sauce. Okay, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it's spicy. And so you have Augustine. You don't really look to other people, and you have and Augustine was written in Latin, so in a way they really didn't need Greek, right? In their perception, and they also try to cut tie with the Byzantine Empire, especially they set up their own Holy Roman Emperor, right, by the Pope.
Mhm.
That's basically saying that we don't need the old Rome anymore. We are starting a new Rome. Like we are starting a like our own Rome. Like that's the whole Holy
Mm.
Roman Empire thing. And Charlemagne is the emperor. So the title for emperor was not lightly given, like in that period of time, like in that age. The title emperor or the title king is given specifically to like it's talking about certain, like you can even say it's a celestial kind of order there. Like,
Mm.
so when you call someone an emperor, you're really saying that he's in a certain like hierarchical degree in the cosmos. It's not just he's a monarch. That's not it.
Mm.
So they're really setting up a really a new cosmos apart from the old cosmos. That's what they were trying to do.
Mm.
And you don't need connection with the old cosmos. So no Greek, and without Greek, but the thing is that in the Bible or in a lot of theological sources, there are a lot of things. If you don't understand Greek, you don't understand what it is, and that's a problem. Then you need to explain what they are. But without the Greek mentality, without Greek language, without all these things, how do you explain these? They
Mm.
need to make up new understandings. They need to make up new ways of trying to explain these things.
Right. Yeah.
That's what scholasticism is. They try to explain things. They try to uh, figure out in their own terms what does it mean, in their own understanding what does it mean. And
Right.
of course, after Crusade, after the Crusade is a very interesting period of time with a lot of interesting things going on. On one hand, they grab a lot of Eastern materials back to the West, and and translated them into Latin. And also they have like Aristotle, and try to like emerge the philosophy into their theological discussion. And at the same time, they also like invented a lot of things that, even though the East has the similar material but never come to the legends like that. For example, the Holy Grail, like that's entirely a Western thing. The West made up the Holy Grail thing based on a lot of Eastern materials, but the East has the material but never come to that kind of like understanding. The legend, we never have that legend at all. So like that's when they try to cut tie, they try to have their own understanding, but they also realize that there are so many fascinating things in the East. Then how do we understand it? They have to elaborate on those things. So scholasticism came in without Greek, and they just, if you don't understand language, then how do you understand things? Well, through
So the
pure language logic.
Yeah, so yeah, and to add to that, so the scholasticism has to come in because once you get to Saint Maximus, right? Saint Maximus the Confessor, he
Mm,
is sixth century, right? Sixth century, I think sixth
around
century.
that time,
Once
yes.
you, yeah, around that time, once you get to him, we see in his writings that he has like a mixture of the Koine Greek that came before him, which is what the early church was using and the New
Mm,
Testament writers used. And then he has also a mixture of a later form of the Greek
right,
language. So
right.
we see in his time the Greek language starts to change.
Mhm.
It becomes a different thing, and then after him, it seems to morph into something. It's a different kind of Greek. It's a different flavor at that point. So around the
Right.
sixth century, you see this, but then especially towards like the seventh and the eighth. And then not only that, but we know that around the seventh to, this is a very broad range I'm giving here because it's not sure, but around like the seventh to ninth century and somewhere in this time period, that there were reforms done in terms of like how manuscripts are written. So they went from using all uppercase, the majuscule
Mm.
text, to the minuscule text. So you have this reform going on. You have the Greek language changing. And apparently you even have like theological and political things happening, right, as well during this
Right.
time period. So
That's
like
the
we start to
about
see
the
some,
right,
yeah,
the rise of
go ahead.
Islam. The rise of
Yeah, the rise
Islam.
of Islam.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so there's like some political things going on, and there's even some theological things apparently, because even though the Orthodox and the Catholics, we were one until 1054, even
Mm.
before that, and the centuries before that, there were some problems apparently, and we see some of that pop up around this time as well. So it
Yeah.
seems like there was a lot of stuff happening in this time period,
Yeah,
like
yeah,
around,
yeah.
let's say, seventh, eighth, ninth, 10th centuries, that seems to
Yes.
result in the language just slow, the understanding original, just the original understanding slowly becomes
Right.
lost, basically, to
Yeah, yeah.
people, to the Christians who are not, an integral part of the tradition that was being passed down in the East. The
Mm.
understanding of the Greek became lost to them over time. Okay. And then, of course, back to what we wrote in the book, once you get to the 13th, 14th century, 13th, 14th century, only like five people in
Mm.
Latin Christendom know Greek at all. And
Right.
even their understanding probably is completely different than the original, because maybe they know the grammar, but they have no clue about the concepts, right?
That's
And the
right.
only way
Mm.
we can know the concepts is thoroughly examining the language, from a linguistic study, the context, and the comparative cultures, right? So
Mm.
yeah, I just wanted to throw that in there. I think that it's important to note that the understanding of Greek became lost. Okay, it became lost in this
Yes.
way to the West, and that's one of the things that we're doing in our book, is we're trying to, well, first of all, bring recognition to that, and then secondly, to
Yes.
bring the ideas that were lost to light,
Mm.
right? Again,
Mm-hmm.
so
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So the idea is that without the language, we have to understand a lot of things from a pure
yeah,
logical
and
deduction.
and then yeah, and then
Mm.
so yeah, and so what you said, the scholasticism has to come in. If they don't
Yeah,
understand the
yeah,
original text,
yeah.
and its concepts in the original language, then they have to
Hmm.
bring in something to do that. So the
Yeah.
scholasticism comes in. You have writers like
Mm.
Anselm, and there's another one who slips my mind, but that seem like they're
Aquinas.
developing. Yeah, Aquinas, yes,
Aquinas.
who
Yes.
are seems like they're
Yeah.
developing off of the ideas that ultimately can go back
Yeah.
to Augustine, you
Yeah.
could say. But
Right.
again, Augustine, we know that yeah.
Yeah, the three A's, like Augustine, Anselm, and Aquinas. The three A's.
Yeah, the
The
three
triple
A's,
A.
the triple A's.
Yeah.
And yeah, and like you said, Augustine did not know Greek.
Hmm.
And there's actually there's not only historical evidence for this, but there's also like evidence for this in terms of the very, language of what he was using,
Mm.
because we know that he was using a text that had textual variants that were only in a Western tradition of manuscripts, and in particular certain Latin versions of the New Testament,
Mm.
and that caused him to come to some wrong theological
Mm.
conclusions. Now, I know that's a big claim, and I guess we could talk about that at
Mm.
some point if you want. But
Mm.
I'm thinking of Romans 5:12, of course. We have that in our book. By the way,
Mm.
you can see. All this stuff again is available for anybody to see. It's not just in our book. You can find this in textual commentaries on the New Testament. You can find
Mm.
this in the critical editions of the Greek New Testament. All this data that we put back in the book, though, that we put out on the Orthodox Understanding, the manuscript data. Augustine apparently used a reading from a few select manuscripts in the Western tradition that read a certain way that the Greek manuscripts did not sometimes. And it's not
Mm.
just Augustine. This is a problem in general when you look at some versions, like the Latin compared to the Greek. That's just how it is.
Mm.
Anyways, yeah, that's what I wanted to add to that. I think that's important to take
Yeah.
note of there.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's very important for our purpose too, because that's exactly what we're trying to reverse. We're trying to tell people that don't just read don't just study theology from a purely logical kind of scholastic point of view, like that from
Yeah.
using not don't just use that methodology. Go back to the language and try to think culturally as how ancient people think. Of course, it's not possible for you to think exactly the same as how ancient people think. That we are all influenced by our own culture. We have our own formations that are different from ancient people. So uh but try try the best, make yourself
Yeah.
as ancient as you can, as Greek as you can, and that
Yeah.
helps us that helps us to understand the scriptures and to understand the concept, the whole conceptual context, the whole conceptual world of those people, and really, like, if you understand this way, you will do theology differently. Like, you would
Yeah.
do theology in a way that the biblical authors would do. They
Oh
never
yeah.
did theology in a way that is simply purely logical, deductional, or inductional. That's not like that. They were looking for patterns. They were looking for, so that's why you see many people think that, especially critical scholars, which is
Hmm.
honestly, it's not a very smart thing to do. But for them, like, they what they would do is that, they would say, you have two similar stories in the Bible. That must be two different, the same story in different sources, and the authors didn't know that and just put them together.
Yeah.
But that's not the
Yeah.
case. They were intentionally written this way because they were looking for patterns. They were creating patterns. That's how ancient writings work. That's how
Yeah.
theological works were written at that time, in the ancient time. That's exactly how it should happen. If
Yeah.
it's not just they're using the same source, they're using the same story from different sources and combine them together, and you have, like,
Mm.
sort of, they what how they the critical scholars understand it as, like, contradictions,
Yeah.
between stories, and this, that's all made up. That's not, they didn't, that that that's a, that's
Back
frustrating to me a
to
little bit.
Yeah. Yeah, well, yeah, me too. Yeah, and no, I think what you just highlighted a really another big problem that
Mm,
one that I see especially in the circles that I'm familiar with is like for example whenever I was trying to explain the gospel and the idea of sacrifice and stuff in the East, I was trying to explain to a friend that, well, a colleague. I was trying to
mm,
explain to a colleague that Jesus' sacrifice was not to pay a debt. It was to be given as a gift.
mm,
And then we're just forgiven because that's what God chooses to do. He just forgives
mm,
us. So it's not that there's a debt that's being paid. But then he asked, well, how can the forgiveness be made if there's not a debt to be paid? And so it's like a very logical, it's like it's like you have to go
mm.
from A to B and B to C and C to D, but
Yeah.
people aren't thinking in terms of the concept. They're not thinking in terms of the image. They're not thinking in terms of the dynamic. They're not thinking in terms of the relation, like the
Mm.
relationship mentality, which is what
Yeah.
the East
Yeah.
had. They think that it has to be very logical. It has to be A does B and B does C and C does D.
Yeah.
But it's not like that, right? It's not like
Mm.
that. And if you have that mentality, like what you just said, if you have that mentality, it will lead you to wrong conclusions. Like you
Exactly.
can you can't have that mentality too strictly. And I'm sure you could give more examples. But yeah, I'm thinking of some other examples right now.
Mm.
But
Mm.
yeah, there's other examples we could give of this. One is of there was somebody who said, wasn't Eunice an apostle? Because in Romans it says that her husband, I forget what's Eunice and what's her husband's name?
Eunice, and I don't remember.
Okay, well, so anyways, Eunice or Eunice and her husband in Romans are counted to be among the apostles, or they're like the
Mm.
most they're recognized among the apostles, which
Mm.
the construction in Greek is in plus the dative.
Mm.
Okay, and in grammars and stuff, it teaches that means that they are in that group. But the problem is that that's thinking about it very mechanistically. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
it's not like a machine, where it's like
Yes.
a programming language. It's not
Mm,
like a programming language where A equals B equals B, A equals B, B equals C, C equals D. It's not like that. You have to think about the context. Okay, Paul was not saying Eunice was an apostle. Okay, because that's not what he would have said in his culture and
mm,
context. And Paul says elsewhere a bunch of stuff that doesn't lead us to that conclusion, anyways.
mm,
The better way to interpret that passage is to understand it as Eunice was under her husband, and so they're considered in the same group. Kind of like how in Hebrew,
mm,
whenever there's female characters with male
mm,
characters, it's the
mm,
masculine ending that's used because
mm,
the females are considered to be in the group of the masculine character, of
mm,
the male characters. And so, like in the book of Ruth, for example, sometimes Ruth and Naomi are referred to with masculine grammar in terms of the endings of verbs and stuff. But the reason is because apparently there were male relatives with them or male figures with them who were watching over them for their protection that aren't explicitly mentioned in Ruth because that's not the purpose of Ruth.
that's right.
Ruth wasn't written to tell you all these details. I mean, he assumes as the
Mm,
reader that you already know that stuff, right?
right.
See, and that again, like what we said previously, it is not up to the Bible to explain all this stuff to us. It is on us to
Mm,
do the research to properly understand it, right?
right, right.
And these ideas are just lost on us. And so
Mm,
Paul is writing in that culture, in that Hebrew culture. And so whenever he says that Eunice and her husband, by the way, he mentions the husband first. I'm just the name of the husband is slipping me, but they're both saints. But Eunice is not an apostle, okay?
mm,
He mentions the husband first,
mm,
and then the wife, and he says they are among the apostles in plus the dative. That first of all, that doesn't have to mean that they are both apostles. Okay, that can mean a number of things. All right, you
yes.
cannot follow the grammars and the syntax books
Mm,
so mechanistically. It's not like
mm,
that. Okay, it's a language. Okay, there's a dynamic.
mm,
There's a bunch of different things that could mean, and you have to consider the context and the culture first. Okay, that's what
mm,
you know, and my so my friend said that the people who were telling him that Eunice was an apostle said, "Well, I don't believe what you're saying. That she's not an apostle because you're just
mm.
saying just trust me, bro." So I told him I said, "Well, you should say to them the same thing. Just say, well, I also don't accept. Just trust me, bro. Like, why are you saying that she was an apostle, right?" It's not it's yeah.
Yeah.
So the better answer is that the culture and the context do not point to that. Okay.
Yes. Mm,
So anyways, that was kind of a rabbit trail there, but that was an
mm,
example to say what we were just saying there,
yeah.
that you have to consider these things and keep this into perspective. So
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
yeah, so one other thing I just wanted to add, and just as some icing on the cake here, is that from my own research, and I've done a lot of research, and you know this, Dolemen, that I've done a lot of
Mm,
research in lexical studies, like comparing
yes.
lexicons, going through resource after resource, word after word. I'm
Mm,
working on my own lexicon. I've been working on this for years, this lexical project for
right.
years.
Mm,
And what I have found, and not only that, but I have deep interest in textual criticism. I mean,
mm,
I studied under Dr. Wallace. From my research in that, okay, in lexical studies and in TC, I've also found that it seems like there is evidence from a textual critical perspective that Greek words, that the concepts and some of the understandings of more finer nuances of Greek words were lost over time.
mm,
So once you get into the middle, like deeper in the Middle Ages, not like early, but like deeper in the Middle Ages, as you get further into the Middle Ages, not late,
mm,
but towards the middle-ish time, we see that some words in Greek that could be considered synonymous by our standards in English, but definitely not originally, they start to be assumed to be synonymous. Okay, and
mm,
so to give you an example, okay, the Greek, and this is just an example, okay, there's others, all
mhm,
right, that could be
mhm,
given. But one is like dechome and
mhm,
lambano. So dechome means to receive, okay?
mhm,
The image is you are waiting to take something from
mhm,
somebody else who's giving it to you, okay? So that's the
mm,
image. It's like you're waiting to receive what somebody else is offering is what somebody else is giving to you. Okay, that's
mm,
dechome.
mm,
That is the image. And Dolemen and its derivative words like ech Dolemen, apple, ech Dolemen, and so forth, they can focus on different parts of that image. Okay. But when you look at lemveno in Greek, lemveno means like in English to take. It's not that
mm,
somebody's offering something to you and you're waiting to take it. It's something's just laying there and you pick it up
mm,
on your own accord. Okay. So it's
mm,
like you take versus you receive.
mm,
Dechome, you receive, Lamveno, you take. Okay.
mhm,
Now, the problem, though, is that what we see in some medieval manuscripts and later on, like basically later on in the manuscript tradition, you see that words like this that are very similar, that you could say, like in English, and English
mhm,
concepts are synonymous, they start to become textual variants for each other in these manuscripts later
mm,
on. But you never see that you very rarely, if ever, see that in the earliest manuscript witnesses. Like you don't see
mm,
scribes like interchanging these words. You only see it later on, and that suggests to
mm,
me that that these concepts, these differences of images, and these differences of nuances were
mm.
becoming to be lost. Because think about it,
Yes.
like in English. In English, you can use receive and take interchangeably, and that's exactly what you see. If you study Greek, if you're somebody who studies Greek, okay, I ask you, especially the Greek student, if you're listening, to consider this carefully. Check English translations every time lemveno and dechome are used, okay, and look at how it's translated in English. Sometimes they're interchanged in terms of the translation. You'll see sometimes one is translated as take, sometimes as received, and vice versa. But in the original Greek, if you study this carefully, you'll find that there is a difference. There's a nuance between them, and then there's a different image for them. Okay, but that image, apparently, in terms of the manuscript evidence, it reveals to us that that image was lost over time, and that could be for a number of reasons. But I think it goes with what we were just talking about. It goes with like once you get to Saint Maximus, the Confessor, the language changes. There were reforms in the language in that time. There were political problems. Greek becomes lost in the Latin world, even though they still had Greek manuscripts. Okay, they still had some, right? But the original understanding becomes lost. They have a Latin way of thinking, and so some of these nuances become lost. Okay, and that's just a very simple example. Like, that's also not very theologically significant. It's just like
Mm,
receive and take. But I think it's helpful for illustrating the point that the original understanding of the language, even in its not only in its subtleties, but also in major things like concepts, as we've talked about
mm,
before, were lost in the West. And if it's lost, and then of course that's going to affect theology and stuff. So the question we have to all ask ourselves, okay, is first of all, what do we care about? Do we care about what the original Christian faith actually was, what they actually believed, what they actually taught, the way they actually think, and what they actually meant when they wrote the New Testament? Or do we just, as long as we have an understanding, even if it's later, if it makes sense to us and it works in our system, is that what we care about? We have to ask ourselves this question,
mm,
do we care about the original? Or do we just care about what kind of makes sense in our system that's come down
mm,
to us in our own place, even if it's not
mm,
original, right?
mm,
So that's really at kind of the heart of
mm.
of the purpose, behind our book and our whole endeavor here. So,
Yeah.
James,
Yeah.
I think we're going to end it there because we've
Yes.
gone on for some time in this session. So we might cut this into two videos. Do you have anything to add before we sign off?
One more small comment. They
Sure.
actually
Yeah.
take and receive these two words, lambano and dokeo. These two words were actually theologically significant because
Oh, okay.
whenever St. Paul talked about tradition, he talks about um, uh, he used the Lanvano, not Lanvano itself, but the word with the Lanvano root.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, that's right.
So
Yeah.
the reason why is that you are taking from someone. The tradition is not something dead you receive without your own your own kind of how do you say your own effort. The
Mm.
reason why the church say that the tradition is a living tradition is because every generation they are actively learning, actively uh, 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 like working out, actively living out the tradition, taking the tradition, making that their own. Like it's an effort, it's a living thing. It is not
Mm.
something that you take. That's why, like, whenever it
Mm.
comes to tradition, these two words actually are theologically significant.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, that's good stuff, man. Okay. Well, thank you for coming to this video today. Let me restart that. It sounds weird. Okay, three, two, one. Okay, thank you for joining us today in this video podcast series that we're doing on the book, The Orthodox Understanding. The book, The Orthodox Understanding, is currently available in its pre-release version. You can find the links on my channel. Subscribe to James Dolemen as well. There'll be links in the description for his channel. And the book is set to be released. It's set to be published officially by the end of this year. We are currently in the revision stage of the book. If you have any questions or comments or even criticism, you are welcome to post a comment on this video. Please like and subscribe if you like what we do. It really helps us a lot, and we would greatly appreciate it. And finally, one last thing I want to add is that we are also working on a separate project. It is our Third Corinthians project. So what we have done is we have looked at all of the past scholarship in both the English scholarly world as well as the German and the French scholarly world on the Greek text of Third Corinthians, and we have produced a new and updated critical edition of the Greek text. Okay, and Dolemen has also wrote the commentary on the Third Corinthians, and we've even translated for the first time ever in English in full Saint Ephraim the Syrian's commentary on Third Corinthians into English. So there will be more to come on that in the future. I recorded some Greek readings on my channel, which you can see of Third Corinthians. And you're welcome to see that if you like. There will be links in the description of this video as well. Okay. Any final closing thoughts? Anything at all, Dolemen?
I can't think of anything right now. Yeah, I think
Okay. All right.
we really talked a lot today.
Okay.
Mm.
Thank you for joining me again, Dolemen, and thank you for everyone who listened. Keep seeking the truth.